Guys, so today we're going to talk a little bit about primary research. As you've seen on the persuasive essay prompt, one of the requirements is to have done some primary research. So what is primary research? Well, primary research is research that you go out and do, that you collect, that you gather. So information that you're not getting from a secondary source, meaning from someone else, right? But research that you've done on your own. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a few types of primary research that you can do for this paper. Okay, so probably one of the most common types of primary research is just a simple interview, right? So let's say for this essay, should we restrict freedom of speech, or should we place limitations on freedom of speech? Well, you might want to interview your philosophy professor in order to get his or her take on that matter, or maybe a lawyer that you might want to go and speak with him or her, right? This would be conducting an interview. Now, when you're conducting an interview, obviously you want to make sure that you understand what information that you're seeking, or understand the purpose of your interview before you do that. Make sure to set this up in advance, right? Give yourself time. Always prepare a list of questions. I think sometimes you might understand in your mind kind of what information you're seeking, but it's better to have a list of questions. That way, if you get nervous, or if the conversation is going really well, you don't lose focus of the information that you want to obtain. Always record your information. Take note of the date, the time, the location, right? And always thank the interviewee after you complete your interview. Do make sure that the person that you're interviewing, if you're using them as an authority, make sure that they are an authority. So it would be totally appropriate for this paper to interview a lawyer, for example, or to interview maybe a professor. Now, if you wanted to interview a few students to see what their view on the matter was, that would also be appropriate. But just going and interviewing your mom, for instance, I don't know if that would be appropriate for this paper. So do think about, okay, who can I interview that's going to be a reliable source on the matter and is going to have an overall credible ethos. Okay, so another type of primary research is the experiment. And some of you may have done experiments in other classes. You may have even gone and gotten IRB approval, right? The Institutional Review Board. Now for this paper, experiments are probably not going to be appropriate because you don't have time to go through the Institutional Review Board process. What that is, for those of you who don't know what the IRB is, well, it's essentially a review board, kind of a committee at every institution that reviews the experiments that students and faculty are doing. And you might ask, well, why? Why do they have to approve that? Well, for some of you who've taken sociology, you know that there have been some terrible experiments done in the past, right? Some involving children, some involving prisoners, just some really awful studies. And so at this point, we like to make sure that all experiments are ethical. So you can imagine if you thought, oh, well, should there be restrictions on hate speech, for instance? And you're like, well, I'll go and do some experiments on that. Well, that might be really unethical, right? So for this essay, you probably won't do an experiment. However, I do want you to be aware that this is one form of primary research. Okay, surveys are another very common type of primary research that you can do. I always say make sure that your questions are easy to tabulate, easy to rank, easy to quantify and analyze. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're giving people short answer questions, that's going to take you a long time to tabulate. Where if you ask yes/no questions, or on a scale of 1 to 5 questions, that becomes very quick to tabulate your results. So be mindful of that when you're doing a survey. Again, always be careful about questions. Really think about your questions. Think about the information you want to obtain. Make sure that your questions are not biased, right? Make sure that you survey enough people that your results are meaningful. If you go and survey 5 people, that's not really going to be meaningful. For most of my classes, I try to push over that 50 mark, right? Try to get more than 50 surveys. Some people try to go over 100, so you might set a personal goal, but I would say probably about 50. You are welcome to use social media if you'd like to obtain results, or you can do the traditional old-fashioned actual paper survey where you go out on campus and pass those surveys out and collect them. That's always awkward, and just know that that is part of the process. That for most scholars and researchers, we've been there where you're out and you feel awkward doing this. So if you're, asking people and trying to hand out a survey and you feel awkward, just know that many of us have been there before. It's part of the process. Okay, and then there's the observation, right? And this is more passive than the others. This is where you just go and you look at something and kind of study it and take note, right? So last year we had a kind of very extreme religious group on campus, and one of my students went and just observed what was going on there to see if this religious group was kind of going over the line, so to speak, in terms of their speech, right? So that would be an example of an observation where you kind of just sit passively and you take note of what you're seeing, right? So always take copious notes when you're doing an observation. Be aware of how long you spend at a place, so you can write down, okay, I'm here from 2:30 to 3:30, right? And don't simply see what you want to see, right? If you're doing an observation, make sure that you're really looking at everything and not just trying to see what, like, oh, well, this would be useful for my paper. That helps you seem unbiased. Okay, so that's primary research. These are 4 types of primary research that you could do or that you could engage in for this paper. The experiment, like I said, I would caution you before trying out an actual experiment. Please email me if you have an idea, and I can kind of see if it's ethical, but be mindful of that. But as you begin to think about your paper, you will most certainly want to get thinking about the primary research that you need to conduct in order to back up your point.